I'm so glad to spend some time with you here in the study today. Today, we will be reading Quintus Curtius, History of Alexander, Book 8, about the Battle of Hydaspes between Alexander of Macedon and Porus, a king of India. I will be reading from the Loeb Classical Edition with a translation by J.C. Rolfe, and we will use some of these little figures to show the battle line and strategy as it develops. And then we'll have a look at some of the Latin text and go through some of the more frequently encountered vocabulary in the description of military engagement and warfare that you will see in many of the histories, not only of Curtius, but also Livy, Julius Caesar, Suetonius, and many of the Latin authors. Alexander had been in Asia on campaign for about 5 years when his troops became restless and homesick, and he encountered some internal problems. He had to fight many battles, its more decisive battles against Darius and Darius's subsequent leaders before he became king of Persia and declared himself king of Asia. To rally his troops' morale and consolidate his power in Asia, he descended into the subcontinent at the foothills of the Himalayas in what is now the Punjab region, and met a great Indian army led by the king Porus on the river Hydaspes. We'll use this rope to show the river. There we are. Alexander arrived on the north bank of this river with his troops. You'll forgive the anachronism of some of these figures. Porus and his army were on the south bank. Alexander sent scouts along the riverbank, up and down, to find a good crossing point in order to meet Porus's army. And Porus shadowed him with his own scouts, watching the Macedonians from the opposite bank. Then one night, Alexander left his general Craterus with a camp on the north bank and sneakily went upriver to cross farther upstream in the night. That's when it began to rain. moment the rain ceased, but such thick clouds overspread the sky that they hid the light, and men who were talking together could scarcely recognize each other's faces. The night that darkened the sky would have terrified anyone else, since it was necessary to sail upon an unknown river, when perhaps the enemy were holding that very bank at which they were blindly and recklessly aiming. But the king, Alexander, inviting glory by courting danger, and thinking that the obscurity which terrified the rest was his opportunity, having given the signal for all silently to embark in the boats, ordered the one in which he himself was carried to be pushed off first. The bank at which they aimed was deserted by the enemy, for Porus was still watching Ptolemy only. Therefore only one boat, which a wave had dashed upon a rock, was stranded. The rest reached their goal, and Alexander ordered his soldiers to arm themselves and take their place in the ranks. Ptolemy and Craterus there, keeping Porus occupied, and Alexander crossing upstream, forming his lines. And now the army had formed its wings, and the king himself was leading it. When it was announced to Porus that the bank was held by armed men and that a dangerous moment was at hand, at first, by that defect of human mind which indulges wishful thinking, he believed that Abisaris, his ally in the war, was coming, for so it had been agreed. But presently, as the light grew clearer and revealed the enemy's battle line, Porus sent 100 four-horse chariots and 4,000 horsemen to oppose the advancing column. Among those was Porus's brother and his son, also named Porus. The leader of those troops. Which he sent was Spitaces, his brother, and the greater part of his strength was in his chariots. Each of these carried 6 men, 2 with bucklers, 2 archers stationed on each side. The rest were drivers, who were by no means unarmed. For when it was necessary to fight hand to hand, they dropped the reins and poured a shower of javelins on the enemy. However, on that day this aid was of hardly any use, for, as was said above, the rain, which had fallen with greater violence than usual, had made the plains slippery and unfit for riding, and the heavy and almost immovable chariots stuck fast in the muck and mud holes. On the other hand, Alexander, with his unencumbered light-armed force, charged them vigorously. The Scythians and the Dahae first of all attacked the Indi, then Alexander sent Perdiccas with the cavalry against the right wing of the enemy. And already the battle had begun. Everywhere, when those who drove the chariots, thinking it the last possible aid for their side, began to rush with loose rein into the midst of the contest. This was a common evil for both sides, for the foot soldiers of the Macedonians were trampled at the first attack. And the chariots sent over the slippery and impassable ground shook off those who guided them. The frightened horses of others dragged the chariots not only into the mud holes and pools, but even into the river. A few the enemy's weapons made their way to Porus, who was vigorously urging on the fight. When he saw the chariots wandering all over the field without drivers, distributed the elephants to those of his friends who were nearest to him. So we'll move the river up and form the battle lines. And the companion cavalry on Alexander's flank. And Alexander, after crossing the river in the north, had sent Quintus around. So we'll see where he comes in. Behind those, Porus had stationed the infantry and the archers, as well as those who were accustomed to beat the drums. This, with the Indi, took the place of the sound of trumpets, and the elephants were not terrified. They were not terrified by this noise, since their ears had been long since trained to the familiar sound. The Macedonians were checked for a time by the sight not only of the elephants, but of the king himself. The beasts stationed between the lines of armed men at a distance looked like towers, while Porus itself had almost exceeded the measure of human stature. Porus was a very tall man, perhaps 2 meters tall, or more than 6 feet. The beast on which he rode seemed to add to his height, since it rose as much higher than the other elephants as he did above the rest of his men. Accordingly, Alexander, contemplating both the king and the army of the Indi, said, "At last I behold a danger worthy of my army, and worthy of my spirit. I am dealing at the same time with beasts and with remarkable men." Then, looking at Quintus, he said, "When I, attended by Ptolemy, who had crossed and was going to attack the enemy from the rear, and Perdiccas and Hephaestion have made a charge against the left wing of the enemy, you will see me in the thick of the brunt of the battle. Then you move to the right wing and attack the enemy while they are in disorder. You, Antigenes, and you, Leonatus and Taron, will at the same time advance against the center and attack their front, our spears, which are very long and strong, will never serve us better than against these beasts and their drivers. Bring down those who are mounted on them, and stab the brutes. It is a doubtful kind of strength, and rages more violently against its own men, for it is driven against the enemy by command, against its own men by fear. Having said this, he was the first to put spurs to his horse, and already, as had been planned, he plunged into the ranks of the enemy with Quintus' mighty force charging in the left wing. The phalanx, too, at the first onset burst through the middle of the line of the Indi. But Porus, where he saw that the cavalry were charging, ordered the elephants to be advanced. being slow and well-nigh immovable, could not equal the speed of the horses. The barbarians, too, could make no use of their arrows, for since these were long and very heavy, they could not safely and conveniently fit them to the bow, unless they first rested its end upon the earth, and as the ground was slippery, and therefore interfered with attempting this, by the time they were ready to take aim, they were overtaken by the speed of the enemy. Therefore, disregarding the king's order, which generally happens when it is fear rather than a leader that begins to issue the sharper commands to men who are in great confusion, there were as many commanders as there were scattered bands. One was giving orders to unite the line of battle. And others to envelope the enemy from behind, some to stand fast. There was no general plan of action. Porus, however, with a few over whom shame had more power than fear, proceeded to collect his scattered forces. And to advance against the foe, giving orders that the elephants be put in front of his line of troops. The brutes caused great terror, and their trumpeting not only threw into confusion the horses, animals so fearful of everything anyway, but also the men and the ranks. And already those who shortly before were victors were looking about for an opportunity for flight, when Alexander sent against the elephants the light-armed Agriani and other Thracian troops better in a rapid attack than in close combat. These cast a great shower of weapons both upon the elephants and upon those who were guiding them. The phalanx also began steadily to attack. The terrified animals, but some who pursued the elephants too eagerly, so irritated them by wounds that they turned upon them, hence, being trampled underfoot, they served to the rest as a lesson to attack with greater caution these enormous beasts. It was a particularly awful spectacle when with their trunks they seized men and their weapons and passed them over their heads to the drivers. As a result, the shifting battle, as they now pursued, now fled from the elephants, prolonged the undecided contest until late in the day. Therefore the elephants, at last worn out by runes, rushed upon and overthrew their own men. And those who had guided them were hurled to the ground and trampled to death by them. And now, like cattle, more frightened than dangerous, they were being driven off the field of battle, when Porus, abandoned by many of his followers, began from his own elephant to pour upon those who surrounded him many javelins, which had been made ready in advance. And although he wounded many at long range, he himself was exposed to shots from every side. He had already suffered 9 wounds, now in his back, now in his breast, and had lost so much blood that his arms were weak, and the weapons which he tried to throw rather fell from his hands. And were not hurled with any force. His elephant too, roused to madness, and not yet wounded, charged with no less vigor against the enemy's ranks, until the driver of the beast saw that the king had collapsed, had dropped his weapons, and was hardly conscious. Then he urged the monster to flight, pursued by Alexander. In the end, there was great discussion about taking prisoners, and eventually Alexander spared Porus and made him the governor king of the Macedonian province in India, the great Macedonian Empire. Let's go over some of the words from the Latin text that are commonly used for military engagements. We'll take our troops off the field if they've had a very long and violent battle. The elephants, the chariots, the Thracians, the elephant drivers, we'll just keep a few here, and we'll take up the Hydaspes River as well. So we'll be using our notebook and this pen. It's a very short pen. What words will we see? Iamque agmen in cornua divisum ipse ducebat, cum poro nuntiatur armis virisque ripam obtineri, et rerum ad esse discrimen. And now the army had formed its wings, and the king himself was leading it, when it was announced to Porus that the bank was held by armed men, and that a dangerous moment was at hand. Here we have some very good words here. Agmen, agminis. This is a third declension neuter noun meaning detachment, or a marching army. Very frequent in a lot of the histories. We also have cornurum, cornu, cornis, a fourth declension neuter noun meaning wing or flank. So the right or left flank or wing of an army formation. We also have ripa, or here ripam obtineri, from ripa, ripai, first declension feminine meaning a river bank. Again, very ubiquitous. Very good to remember these ones. Then we have mox liquidore, luce aperiente aciem hostium, centas quadrigas et quattrum milia equitum venienti agminis. hostis, hostis. In the plural, hostis, hostis, third declension, common. And the very interesting one, we have a word for chariots. Here we have quadrigas. This is a four-horse chariot. Quadriga. That will be a four-horse war chariot. And some other words we have for war chariot, which we will encounter in this text, are kurus. Kurus, kurus. And that is a fourth declension masculine. For war chariot or even a racing chariot. And for British war chariots we have Eseda, Esedai. So all different words for war chariot. Dux erat copiarum quas praemisit spidaces frater ipsius. So here we have the leader of the troops which he sent was Spidaces, his brother. Troops, of course, a very good word to know. Copia, copiae, first declension feminine. Troops, or even forces. And then, duos Sagittarios ab utroque latere dispositos. Two archers were stationed on each side. So, you know this word. Sagitta. Yes. And this is a first declension. Sagittai for arrows or archers. We can even put that there. Arrows and archers. And then another weapon, quipe eiacula complura. And we have a shower of javelins, iacula. And you can see the relation here with throwing, iacera, to throw, iaceo. And here we have a iaculum. Exactly, a iaculum. And where are we here? Iaculi. Iaculi. And that's a second declension neuter for javelin. See what else we have. Ubi cominus proeliandum erat. There's our gerund. Proelia, for battle. Proelium. And proeli. Very good one to know. A battle. Or even a fight. And here we have another chariot. Lubricos et iniquitabiles facirat gravisque et propemodum immobiles curus illuie ac foraginibus harerebant. The rain, which had fallen with greater violence than usual, had made the plain slippery and unfit for riding, and the heavy and almost immovable chariots stuck fast in the muck and mud holes. What about our forces? Perdicam deinde cum equitibus in dextrum cornu hostium emisit. There we have a few words that we've already learned. Dextrum, of course, is the right, and cornu, cornis being flank. And here we have hostes, hostium, the enemy, so the enemy's right flank. Perdicam, okay, so the Scythians and the Daci first of all attacked the Indi, then Alexander sent Perdiccas with the cavalry against the right wing of the enemy, cum equitibus. And there is our cavalry. So we have eques in the plural, and equites, cavalry, in the plural, equitibus. And of course, later that will mean the eques, equites, the class of citizen in imperial Rome. We also have nam et Macedonum pedites primo impetu obterebantur. So 2 more very good words here. The Macedonians, nam et Macedonum, for the foot soldiers of the Macedonians, pedites, pedes, pedites, foot soldiers or infantry. Were trampled at the first attack, and the chariots sent over the slippery and impassable ground. So what we have is primo impetu. Impetu. The first attack comes from impetus and impetus. And that will be an attack, a rush, a charge. So here we have some very ubiquitous vocabulary, words having to do with battle and military. We have Quintus Curtius writing at about 50 AD in the imperial period, when the emperors of Rome were trying to be legitimate in their power and consolidate their illustrious history. I wish you a very peaceful day. Be good to yourself. Be kind to the elephants.